In 2008, two young mothers disappeared during a violent storm after seeking shelter in a centuries-old chapel in Ashwood Hollow, leaving behind only whispers and unanswered prayers. For 15 years, the village carried the weight of their absence until a strange melody began to rise from beneath the chapel floor, leading to a discovery more chilling than anyone could have imagined. The wind howled that night, but something else was singing from below. The wind howled like an ancient lament, rattling the stained glass windows of St. Agatha's Chapel, nestled at the edge of the sleepy village of Ashwood Hollow. A storm was coming, not just a thunderstorm, but one of those long, growling tempests that seemed to crawl out of the soil itself, awakening old stories long buried. At 8:47 p.m., just after the last echoes of the Sunday evening hymns had faded, two young mothers remained behind while the rest of the congregation scattered under umbrellas and plastic ponchos. Emma Cartwright and Lila Monroe stood near the altar, their raincoats soaked through, hair clinging to their faces, cheeks flushed not from the cold, but something else, something less tangible. "It doesn't feel right," Emma whispered, her eyes tracing the edges of the old choir loft, now draped in dust. "It's the storm," Lila replied, adjusting her daughter's drawing that had slipped from her purse, a childish sketch of the chapel oddly fixated on a black door under the altar. "Or maybe the memories," she added. "We practically grew up here. Remember the retreats, the chanting in the basement, that weird silence every time we mentioned music?" Thunder cracked, shaking the entire structure. The power flickered, then died. In the sudden hush, the candlelight painted shadows like ghosts across the walls. The chapel, for all its holiness, felt suddenly claustrophobic, like a sealed vault. Emma turned toward the pews. "We'll wait the storm out here. I don't want to drive back on Highway 12 in this madness." Lila nodded in agreement. As the wind grew stronger, they gathered near the pulpit, lighting a few extra candles. But Emma's hands trembled as she reached into her coat pocket. "I'm going to write something, just in case." She pulled a church bulletin from the stack and flipped to the blank back. Her pen moved quickly, nervously. "If I don't come back, ask Father Brenton about the music room." Without a word, she slipped the note into the back of the old family Bible on the pulpit, behind the Gospel of John. "Why'd you do that?" Lila asked, her voice brittle. Emma didn't answer immediately. She was staring at the wooden floorboards beneath the altar, a section that looked slightly newer than the rest. "I've had dreams," she murmured, "of voices singing, coming from under here." The storm outside roared louder. A branch slammed against the chapel's side, making both women jump. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors blew shut with a loud thud. Candles flickered violently. The whole chapel went eerily still. Then it began. A soft hum, not from above, not from the wind, from below. A tone, human, unmistakably so, began to rise, so faint at first that Emma thought it was in her head. But then Lila gripped her wrist, nails digging into her skin. "You hear it too?" she whispered. It's music," Emma breathed. "Like a hymn, but slower, wrong." They backed away from the altar. The air had changed, colder now, and damp. A smell of wet earth and mold crept up from the floorboards. "We need to leave," Lila said, trying the front doors. "Locked. No way," she muttered. She banged on the wood. They weren't locked before. Emma's eyes scanned the chapel, settling on the stairwell leading down to the old vestry and choir practice rooms. "It's coming from down there," she said flatly. "Don't," Lila warned, her voice cracking. "Please." But Emma was already moving. Step by creaking step, she descended into the dark. The flashlight on her phone flickered as she reached the bottom. The hall smelled stronger now, like stone and time. She passed old wooden doors, names of long-dead priests etched into their glass, and then she found it. A door at the end of the hallway, marked with no label. It looked older than the rest. On its center, a carved clef note, nearly worn smooth. Emma reached out, hand trembling. Just as she touched it, she heard Lila scream upstairs. The sound was cut off by a loud, echoing slam. The door creaked open. Inside was darkness. A piano sat at the far end, keys gleaming faintly in the light from her phone. On the walls, dozens of choir robes, some still dusty, others damp. On the floor, a cracked phonograph player. A record lay beside it, labeled only Cantus 14. Emma reached down, picked it up, and froze. The name beneath the title was her mother's, Margaret Cartwright. She hadn't been to this church since the 80s. She had never spoken about it. Lightning flashed, and behind her, the door slammed shut. The next morning, the sun rose over Ashwood Hollow as if nothing had changed, its golden light slicing through the mist that blanketed the hills and casting warm glows over dew-soaked rooftops. But everything had changed. By 7:00 a.m., the parish's caretaker discovered the chapel's front doors still locked from the inside. He unlocked them with his master key, expecting nothing more than to tidy up the aftermath of a stormy Sunday. Instead, he found 2 abandoned coats on the front pews, a half-burnt candle still flickering on the pulpit, and a Bible left open, something that never happened in a place where order was sacred. More unsettling than the silence or the untouched stillness of the chapel was what he did not find: Emma Cartwright and Leila Monroe. Within the hour, the caretaker had contacted the local police. Ashwood Hollow's sheriff, Henry Brackett, arrived on the scene with 2 deputies, already dreading what this might turn into. Small towns didn't handle disappearances well. They had too much history and too little tolerance for the unexplained. The search began with protocol: a sweep of the chapel, a call to the last known contacts, and a canvass of the area surrounding the building. No signs of struggle, no signs of forced entry or exit, every window locked from the inside. Nothing overturned or broken. No screams reported during the storm, just those 2 coats and a deep, unnatural stillness. Then, Deputy Lauren found the footprints. Dust gathered thick beneath the pews and in the corners of the aisles, especially near the chancel, a fine white-gray layer untouched for years. Except now, it bore smudges. The prints weren't obvious at first, but once spotted, they formed a faint trail. They led from the altar, past the pulpit, directly to the back corridor, the one that led to the old stairwell. "No one uses that part anymore," the caretaker said, his voice tight with unease. "It's been locked up since, I don't even know, early 90s maybe." Sheriff Brackett followed the path himself, flashlight scanning over worn stone walls, framed photos of past pastures collecting decades of grime. At the end of the corridor, the footprints stopped at a locked iron door. The hinges were rusted, the lock looked ancient, but new scrape marks circled the keyhole, like someone had forced something inside or tried to pick it. "Who has the key to this?" the sheriff asked. The caretaker hesitated. "Only Father Brenton." That name rang through the chapel like a challenge. Father Thomas Brenton had served Ashwood Hollow for over 20 years. Stoic, soft-spoken, deeply respected, and yet always distant. He wasn't answering his phone. At first, it wasn't unusual. Spotty reception in the village had always been a problem, especially during storms. But by noon, with the town already murmuring about missing women in the old chapel, the sheriff sent a deputy to Brenton's rectory across the street. The house was unlocked, the bed made, no dishes used, no signs of breakfast. The kettle was cold, but on the desk, a journal, open to a half-written page that read only, "I should have told them before the voices came back. But now and the ink bled out, ending mid-stroke. Brackett called for a formal bolo, but the state police were slow to respond. It was just a disappearance, no evidence of crime. Besides, people had gone missing in storms before. Still, by sunset, Ashwood was boiling with unease. The sheriff stood on the chapel steps, trying to make sense of what little they had. No signs of blood, no sign of the 2 women, no sign of Brenton, no vehicle missing, no other exit from the building, just that single, locked door and a set of footprints that led to it, but never away. That night, the choir director came forward. She had seen Father Brenton leave the rectory just after midnight, his coat unbuttoned despite the wind, walking swiftly toward the rear of the chapel. "He had something wrapped in cloth," she said. "It looked heavy, and he wasn't walking like himself, like he was being pulled forward." She hadn't thought much of it at the time. Brenton was known to walk late at night, often going to pray during storms, but now every detail became a clue. The sheriff returned to the chapel that evening alone, armed with a crowbar and more questions than answers. He stood before the iron door, its cold surface slick with moisture. He struck the lock twice before it cracked open. The door creaked open, and behind it only darkness. He shone his flashlight down a stone staircase, the air so damp and heavy it choked. "Brenton?" he called out. Silence, then something faint. Not music, not exactly. More like the impression of a sound, the feeling of a melody hanging on the edge of hearing. He descended. The smell hit first, old rot, like wet leaves and mildew. Then the staircase opened into a chamber, low ceiling, lined with bookshelves. At the center, a grand piano, covered in dust, but not as much as one would expect. On the lid, a red handprint, small, possibly female. There were robes here, too, choir uniforms. A row of them hung like silent witnesses. One was torn at the collar. A discarded shoe lay beneath the bench, a flat brown leather one, stained darker at the heel. The sheriff called forensics. He didn't sleep that night. Neither did the village. By dawn, news spread that Father Brenton had officially vanished. His car was still in the garage, his wallet on the table, but his passport was missing. A witness came forward, a trucker who claimed to have picked up a man matching Brenton's description at a truck stop 30 miles north, around 2 a.m. The man paid in cash, said he was heading somewhere quiet, asked the trucker if he believed in voices that live in walls. The trucker thought it was just a drunk preacher. No one's seen Brenton since. By the end of the second day, the state declared the disappearance of the two women under active investigation. But inside Ashwood, people began speaking in lowered tones again. Some said it was the storm that took them. Others said the chapel had secrets it never gave up. And the sheriff, every time he closed his eyes, saw that red handprint on the piano lid, heard the echo of an almost song vibrating through the stone. Years passed like dust settling over a forgotten chapel pew. Ashwood Hollow remained unchanged to the casual eye. The same sleepy village, the same crooked lampposts, the same fog that kissed the fields each morning. But for two children, everything had changed forever. Nora Cartwright was 5 when her mother vanished that stormy night, and Isaac Monroe had been 4. In the immediate aftermath, they were taken in by their respective aunts, sisters of Emma and Lila, who lived 2 streets apart. Their lives were quietly mended with routines, school, and bedtime stories that never mentioned the chapel. But trauma has its own rhythm, silent and persistent, like the echo of a hymn you can't quite remember. Nora, now 17, carried the hollow ache of her mother's absence like a hidden wound. She remembered that night with haunting clarity. It wasn't just the storm or the way the lights had flickered at home while she sat in her grandmother's kitchen with cocoa in her hands. It was the moment, around midnight, when she had stood at the window and whispered, "Mommy's singing," even though the house was silent. Her grandmother had said it was the wind, but Nora knew better. She'd heard the music. It was faint, wordless, like a melody hummed through stone. She never told anyone, except Isaac. He remembered it too, though his memory was blurrier. He used to say his dreams smelled like the chapel basement, like old wood and candle smoke. As they grew older, the town forgot, but Nora and Isaac did not. Every year on the storm's anniversary, they'd meet at the hilltop with a blanket and thermos of tea, sitting in silence as the wind swirled. They didn't need words. Grief, shared since childhood, doesn't require translation. By her 17th year, Nora had become quiet, introspective, yet sharp-eyed. She kept a sketchbook filled with charcoal drawings of hands reaching out from cracks in walls, of eyes staring through keyholes. Her aunt called it artistic coping. Her therapist said it was her mind processing absence. But Nora knew what it was: memory. The nightmares had returned in October. Not just the old ones, the vague, storm-soaked echoes of her mother's voice, but new ones, sharper. She'd wake at 3:12 IEM precisely, heart pounding, drenched in sweat, clutching her pillow like a lifeline. In the dreams, she stood at the foot of the chapel, which loomed impossibly tall, its spire splitting the stormy sky like a needle. Inside, her mother waited, but she was not singing, she was knocking, soft rhythmic taps that echoed in hollow walls. Nora woke one morning and, on impulse, opened her phone. She typed the sequence she remembered hearing in the dream: 3 short taps, 1 long, pause, then 2 quick ones. She found a Morse code translator app and entered it. It translated to, "Hey E.L." She stopped breathing. That night, the dream returned. This time, she wasn't inside the chapel. She was underneath it. The air was thick, the ceiling low. She could see her mother's silhouette in front of her, lit faintly by a flickering candle. Emma's eyes met hers, and she began tapping again, this time more insistently. Nora, wake up. The words seared into her skull as she jolted awake, shaking and gasping. She called Isaac at once. He answered groggily, but listened. "You're dreaming of her again?" he asked, concern tensing his voice. "It's different," she whispered. "She's trying to tell me something." "She's alive, Isaac?" He hesitated. "Nora, it's been over a decade. They searched that entire chapel. Remember what the sheriff said?" "They searched what they could see," she said sharply. "But they didn't hear her." Isaac sighed. He'd always been the more rational of the two, grounded by the structure of the life his aunt had built for him. But Nora's conviction shook something loose in him. "Okay," he said finally. "What do you want to do?" "I want to go back," she said. "To the chapel." The old building had been closed off for years. After the disappearance, attendance at St. Agatha's dwindled. People spoke of curses, of haunted hymns, of shadows moving behind stained glass. Eventually, the diocese suspended services and shuttered it. But the building still stood, its doors chained shut, its windows collecting dust and silence. That weekend, Nora and Isaac stood outside its rusted gates, just past midnight. The air was heavy with moisture, and thunder whispered far in the distance. "You sure about this?" Isaac asked. Nora nodded. She pulled a small crowbar from her backpack. "If they won't open the doors," she murmured, "we make our own way in." It took 20 minutes to get through the side window. The moment they slipped inside, the air shifted. It smelled exactly as Nora remembered, the sweet decay of old pew cushions, candle wax, and something beneath it all, something like wet stone. Their flashlight beams cut through the dust. The pulpit loomed, and behind it, the corridor that led to the vestry stairs. Nora froze at the top of the stairwell. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Isaac listened. Faint, barely there, a vibration, not quite sound. "This doesn't make sense," Isaac said. "This place should be sealed." Nora moved toward the far wall. Her hand trembled as she reached out, placing her palm against the stone. Cold, solid. And then, unmistakably, 3 quick knocks. The 15th anniversary of the storm that took Emma Cartwright and Leila Monroe arrived with unsettling precision. A sky brushed in ashen tones and the air hanging thick like it remembered everything. Ashwood Hollow stirred quietly that morning, its residents caught between forgetting and remembering, as if the past hummed under their feet. Despite the years, no formal memorials were ever established for the 2 missing women, perhaps because too many questions remained unanswered, or because the chapel itself stood as a silent monument to mystery and unease. It was Isaac who first noticed it. He had returned to the site with Nora a week prior, and since then had taken to sitting alone near the chapel's overgrown garden, as if waiting for the building to speak. That morning, around 6:03 a.m., as a low fog rolled over the earth, Isaac swore he heard it, a soft, mournful hum, carried not by wind, but from beneath the ground itself. It wasn't imagination. As the village awoke, more people began to report hearing the same thing, a haunting melody, wordless yet deeply human, rising from beneath the chapel's stone floor. By noon, a small crowd had gathered outside the chained doors, whispering, speculating, shifting uncomfortably as the sound ebbed and flowed like a pulse. "It's her," she murmured. "She's still trying to reach us." The townspeople debated, argued, and finally, with the hesitant blessing of the new parish trustee, agreed to reopen the chapel for investigation. Sheriff Brackett, now retired but still living just down the lane, returned upon request, unable to stay away from a story he never finished. "Nothing down there but sealed stone," he said as he entered. "His bricked up the old stairs ourselves. No access since 2010, but the humming persisted. It had intensified by dusk, taking on strange harmonics that made window panes quiver slightly, and unsettled dogs whine along the perimeter fences." A decision was made. They would excavate. The crew arrived the next morning with jackhammers and floodlights. They began with the altar floor, the place where the Cartwright girl and her friend had last been seen, and where, according to a decades-old blueprint, no hollow chambers were recorded. By the third hour, the ground cracked differently, but compacted earth, and then wooden beams. "There's a chamber here," one of the crew called out. "Not in the plans." They continued, dust rising like ancient smoke, then a sharp clank. Metal. A ring of rusted hinges emerged beneath the debris. A door, a trapdoor, wide and iron-framed, sealed with bolts and engraved with Latin script, almost worn to illegibility. Nora stepped closer, heart hammering. The humming was louder now, impossible to ignore. It wasn't playing from any speaker or echo. It vibrated in the marrow of their bones. With careful force, the bolts were pried open. The trapdoor groaned as it lifted, revealing a tunnel steeped in cold air. The smell hit immediately. Damp earth, mildew, and something else, faintly metallic, like the scent of rain on old stone. Brackett went first, flashlight in hand, followed by a forensic expert and Nora, despite every protest. The tunnel descended at a harsh angle, carved through bedrock, the walls uneven and clawed with marks no one could explain. "This isn't part of the church architecture," the expert murmured. "No records show any construction like this. This wasn't meant for the public." After nearly 50 feet, the tunnel opened into a vault-like chamber. It was vast, far larger than anything that should exist beneath a village chapel. Stone pillars lined the walls, each engraved with choir symbols and strange sigils that shimmered faintly under light. And at the center, a circular platform, chained at the perimeter. Upon it sat a broken music stand, and beside it what remained of a wooden stool, splintered as if from violent use. Scattered on the floor were sheets of parchment, some brittle with age, others freshly crumpled, as if touched just days ago. And carved along the wall, a sequence of tally marks grouped in sevens, stretching nearly the full arc of the chamber. "Dear God," Brackett whispered. This was a holding space. Nora moved toward the wall and placed her hand against the cold stone. "She was here," she said softly. She counted the days. From behind her, a voice rose suddenly, real and sharp. Not a ghostly hum, not an imagined tune, but a woman's voice, raw and melodic, singing a single note that rose into a half-formed lullaby. Everyone froze. It came from beyond the back wall. The forensic expert ran a scanner along the stone and found it thin, with a small cavity behind it. A hidden room, still deeper. Another door, buried behind a stack of old liturgical boxes, soon revealed itself. This one was metal, narrow, painted the same color as the stone to disguise it. No keyhole. Only a sliding panel, as if it were meant to be opened from the inside. Nora stepped forward, trembling. She pressed her ear against the door. The song was clearer now, fragile, exhausted. Then, 3 knocks. The knocks froze every thought in the chamber, as if time itself inhaled and held its breath. Nora stepped back from the concealed door, her hand trembling, her eyes wide, with an emotion between terror and hope. "She's in there," she whispered. "It's her. It's always been her." Sheriff Brackett ordered the forensic technician to stand clear while he assessed the hidden doorway. It appeared to be a maintenance shaft once concealed behind the altar wall, but its modifications over the years turned it into a vault. Narrow, reinforced, no obvious mechanism to open from outside. "We can't force it," the technician warned. "If someone's behind there, we could trap or injure them." "Then we listened," Nora said firmly, kneeling and placing both palms flat against the metal surface. The chamber fell into silence again, waiting, listening. A faint sound resumed, humming, but this time accompanied by the scrape of something sliding along the floor. Then a light thud. A soft clink. Brackett gestured and everyone moved back. The technician placed a stethoscope against the panel and nodded. "Something's been passed through." A second later, a narrow metal hatch at the bottom edge of the door creaked open from within. Dust puffed out like a sigh. Inside, resting carefully within a shallow indentation, was a glass bottle. Nora reached for it with gentle hands, as if touching sacred relics. The bottle was old, but intact, sealed with melted paper. She broke the seal and unfurled the page carefully, her fingers tracing the handwriting. It was unmistakable, Herma's, the cursive curves, the small looping G's, the slight leftward slant, habits Nora had studied in birthday cards and scribbled notes preserved in boxes at home. The sheet wasn't merely a letter, it was a music sheet, but beneath the staff lines and scattered notes Words had been penned. Not lyrics, but date 4. Still no sound from above. Day 7. Lila says the priest hears things at night. Day 9. We write songs to stay sane. We remember our daughters. The entries continued for what must have been weeks, then months. Some were short, cold tonight, shared the last candle stub. Others were poetic. The walls hum back when we sing, like the stone remembers. Some were desperate. He won't let us leave. He says the voices outside are dangerous. Nora sat on the cold stone, unable to tear her eyes from the writing. She kept a journal, she murmured, a musical diary. Each sheet is a memory. Brackett knelt beside her. Where there's one, he said, there might be more. The crew resumed their search, careful and slow. Hidden within narrow crevices in the wall, tucked into recesses behind the altar, more bottles were uncovered, 5 in total. Each contained a new sheet, some scrawled hurriedly, others meticulously composed. The last one was different. The notes were disorganized, the handwriting shaky, but at the bottom, in a different ink, a single line. If someone finds this, tell Nora she hums like her mother. The message cracked something in Nora that had been locked away since she was 5. He clutched the paper to her chest and wept, silent and hard, the kind of grief that tastes of both mourning and recognition. As the team catalogued the findings, one of the deputies found an old wooden box in a half-collational corner of the chamber. It was unassuming, dusty, sealed with a simple latch. When opened, inside were a stack of photographs, old and brittle but remarkably preserved. Most were mundane, choir rehearsals, parish dinners, church events from decades prior, but one photo made the room go still. It was taken inside the chapel, possibly years before the disappearances. Standing in front of the altar were 3 people: Emma Cartwright, Lila Monroe, and Father Thomas Brenton. The 2 women smiled warmly, arms loosely linked, wearing choir robes. Brenton stood between them, his expression impossible to decipher because someone had taken a piece of charcoal and furiously scratched over his face. The smudges of black radiated outward like a burn, intentional and violent, obscuring every detail of his features. But what remained visible was his stance, firm, rigid, and his hand, tightly clutched around Lila's wrist. "Who did this?" Isaac asked, holding the photo under a magnifier. "Why erase only him?" Nora examined the back. A faint pencil note, taken after the first rehearsal, "In the lower room. To him," she said slowly, and something changed. Brackett shook his head. "If he was down here with them, that changes everything. All this time we thought he vanished into the night, maybe fled. But what if he stayed? Or worse," the technician muttered, "what if he kept them here?" The humming behind the sealed panel had quieted. Nora turned toward it. "She's waiting. She gave us these for a reason. And maybe," Isaac added, "there are more answers inside." The revelation of the music sheets and the distorted photograph rippled through Ashwood like an old scar torn open. Forensic teams descended into the chamber with renewed urgency, and historians from the regional archives were summoned when the age of the stonework and architectural layout challenged every record in the town's known history. It was Nora who first asked the question everyone else hesitated to voice. What was this room for before it became a prison? The question loomed over the search like a shadow, as more documents and fragments were unearthed from crevices and compartments disguised within the stonework. A pattern began to emerge, one that twisted the narrative of St. Agatha's from spiritual sanctuary into something much darker. In the deepest alcove of the vault, behind a wall of deliberately misaligned bricks, a hidden compartment was pried open. Inside were wooden crates filled with military-stamped folders wrapped in brittle cloth. One folder bore the insignia of an old National Defense Division dated back to the 1940s. Its cover read, "Operation Cantus, Controlled Religious Isolation and Psychological Recalibration." The pages inside detailed a chilling history. During the final years of the Second World War, the chapel had been requisitioned by local authorities as a covert internment site for religious dissenters, pacifists, rogue preachers, and those deemed doctrinally dangerous. These prisoners were not tortured in conventional ways. Instead, they were subjected to isolation in acoustically engineered rooms beneath the chapel, dubbed the music room in classified documents. The rationale was simple and cruel. Sound would be their captors. Records described experiments in sonic containment, using looped hymns, distorted psalms, and madness devices to sing back to survive. Autogerating containment chamber, one paper described. Subjects eventually either join the tonal rhythm or descend into dissociative silence. Nora read the words aloud, her voice faltering as she reached the margins of one document where a scrawled note warned, "Once the chamber learns your tone, it does not forget." Brackett rubbed his face, pale with disbelief. "They used music to cage people?" he muttered, "and maybe that cage never broke." As questions deepened, the forensic team moved behind the secondary wall, where they discovered a narrow hallway previously hidden by collapsible stone panels. This hallway, suffocating and silent, led to a smaller chamber, no larger than a bedroom, its air stale, its walls scorched with age. At the center stood an altar, roughly hewn, surrounded by faded ritual markings. It was Nora who recognized the symbols first, having seen them scribbled at the edges of her mother's old hymnal notebooks, marks resembling treble clefs bent into spiral loops, mixed with geometric sigils that suggested a convergence between spiritual and sonic meaning. The altar itself was etched with lines of Latin text, fragmented but legible enough for a local scholar to translate. The inscription read, "Vox ligatur anima, vox solvit animam," the voice binds the soul. The voice releases the soul. What followed were the whispers. They began softly, like drafts in stone corridors. At first dismissed as tricks of acoustics or the mind, but then came the recordings. The technician monitoring the chamber's ambient levels played back footage where whispers emerged at random frequencies, not present during the actual time of recording. When analyzed, the whispers formed patterns. Some mimicked phrases from the journals Nora's mother had written. Others mirrored Brackett's own voice during a prior briefing. And once, unmistakably, the recording whispered Nora's name. Panic spread among the team, but Nora remained. She walked to the altar and ran her fingers along the carvings, tracing the sigils, letting the chill of the stone pass through her skin like a current. "They weren't just kept here," she said slowly. "They were used. Their voices weren't stolen, they were trapped." In the following days, further excavation revealed soundproof tiles embedded deep into the foundation of the walls, arranged in deliberate geometric alignment, designed to absorb, then mirror, vocal frequencies. Behind the altar, embedded in the stone, were 4 small orifices, mouth, sound here, framed in copper and wired internally to ceramic bowls now cracked with time. They were tonal amplifiers, tuned to specific frequencies. A diagram found nearby labeled them as receptors. Isaac found the final piece, a record buried beneath the altar in a sealed tin, labeled "Sia." Then another voice joined, and another, until a full, haunting harmony rose from the phonograph, a choir of desperate, aching voices, layered and stretched like they were being pulled through time. Nora recognized her mother's voice immediately. Brackett's hands shook as he stopped the record. "They're not echoes," he whispered. "They're still in there." The weeks that followed the discovery of the altar were saturated with unease and sleepless curiosity. Every hour spent beneath the chapel felt like walking into the slow exhale of something ancient and unseen. Specialists arrived from universities and sound laboratories across the state, all drawn to the anomaly of the singing walls. Equipment was installed, vibration monitors, subsonic detectors, parabolic recorders. But it was the calendar that gave them the next clue. It was Isaac, poring through Brackett's old field notes and the town's weather archives, who noticed the pattern. "Every year," he said, laying down the data, "on the exact date of the storm, the one that took Emma and Lila, audio anomalies spike inside the chapel between 3:00 and 3:16 AME. The same window, 15 years straight. The team replayed all the recordings from those intervals, starting from years back when unattended surveillance had still been active. At first the sound seemed random, hums, knocks, subtle rhythmic vibrations. But after isolating the frequencies and layering them chronologically, something strange began to emerge. A repeated motif. It wasn't words, not in any modern language, but it followed a structure, beats grouped in deliberate intervals, pauses held with impossible precision, like breaths between phrases. A linguist specializing in pre-Roman liturgy was brought in, and after days of analysis, she proposed a theory. The structure resembled proto-sacred notation, patterns used by early religious communities to encode meanings into chants long before written language was standardized. It's a tonal language, she explained. Think of it as a plea, a call, repeated year after year until someone responds in the same key. While scientists argued the technical implications, it was a voice from the village that would change everything. Her name was Mavis Calden, a blind woman nearing 90 who had lived in Ashwood her entire life and had once sung in the chapel choir as a girl during the post-war years. She arrived uninvited, led by her grandson, after hearing a local radio segment about the renewed excavations and the strange music beneath the altar. Her presence was met with polite doubt until the moment she stood in the vault, her frail fingers brushing the stone walls, and said softly, "That's not music. That's prayer." When asked what she meant, she requested to hear the audio. The team played the recordings through headphones pressed gently against her ears. She listened, lips parted slightly, her clouded eyes blinking in time with the vibrations. After a long silence, she spoke. "I know this," she said, voice distant. "It's a lullaby, old, forgotten. My grandmother sang it when I was very small, during rituals for the sick. They believed voices could draw out suffering, send it away through tone." The room fell silent. No one moved. Called it Lullaby of the Earth's lullaby. You never sing it alone, always in pairs, always at night, and always with the promise that someone is listening. The scientists dismissed her words as folklore. But Nora didn't. That night she sat in the chapel alone. Rain began falling outside, not a storm, not yet, but the promise of one. She held one of her mother's music sheets, torn and smudged, and hummed softly along its notes. When the wind picked up and the first thunder cracked, she heard it, the reply. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even clear, but it matched her tone, her pitch. From beneath the floorboards, the lullaby answered. She called Isaac and Brackett immediately. "It's the song," she said. "They're still singing back." Mavis returned the next day, insisting on being brought to the altar again. This time she wore a pendant around her neck, an heirloom, she claimed, etched with the same sigils now found in the chamber. She placed it on the altar, humming a line from the lullaby. The floor beneath them vibrated, a new panel shifted in the wall, revealing a narrow chamber. Inside, another bottle rested in a niche, wrapped in linen. The paper inside was fragile but legible. It was Lila's handwriting. "If this song survives us, follow it back to the beginning. He used the music to bind us. Only the music can break it." The inscription from Lila's note echoed in everyone's thoughts. "He used the music to bind us. Only the music can break it." It became both a prophecy and a challenge, pushing the team to redouble their efforts in decoding the tonal patterns and hidden symbols scattered throughout the chamber. But it was Mavis, her memory sharper than anyone expected, who recalled something most had missed. She spoke of a rumor, once whispered among elderly choir members, a sealed door beyond the music chamber, installed during wartime, rumored to lead to an emergency shelter never documented in public. "My uncle was a maintenance man during the war," she said, fingers trembling as she recalled the past. "He once told me there was a room no one spoke of, not for hiding from bombs, but from judgment." The investigators turned their attention to the back of the vault, where the altar's shadows stretched longest. After several hours of acoustic mapping, they discovered a frequency anomaly behind the north wall, a cavity. Carefully, the wall was chipped away, revealing a rusted steel hatch covered in chalk symbols so faint they were almost gone. The hatch opened with a metallic groan, releasing a wave of air stale enough to carry the weight of decades. Flashlights illuminated a narrow corridor carved into the stone like a wound. At the end stood a reinforced bunky door, thick with age and grime, its locking mechanism requiring both manual release and a frequency latch, now cracked and brittle. When opened, the room revealed itself in silence. It was no larger than a hospital room, lined with faded emergency cots and shelves of ancient supplies long since crumbled. On two of the cots, dust-covered cloths lay folded neatly, soft, pale blue with embroidered edges. Nora stepped closer and gasped. They were choir shawls, the very same kind her mother used to wear. One of them had the initials E.C. stitched in the corner. The other, slightly smaller, bore M. The air in the room was thick with emotion, dread, and something else. Presence. Isaac moved toward the far corner, where the beam of his light reflected back from a mirror long shattered. Behind it, curled against the wall, was a figure. Thin, skeletal, draped in what once may have been a robe, the figure didn't move, didn't flinch. But her eyes opened. They were sunken but aware. Nora stumbled forward, tears breaking free as she whispered, "Mom?" The figure, Emma Cartwright, blinked slowly. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. Her throat convulsed as if trying to speak, but only silence followed. She raised a trembling hand instead, touching the air between them. Behind her, on the wall, were markings, dozens of short lines and notations scrawled in charcoal, some clearly musical in nature, others purely timekeeping. Beside them, a drawing, two figures, one standing, one lying down, with a cross drawn above, a note written shakily beneath. Lila, day 311, not enough left to sing. The truth unfolded not in words, but through evidence. Emma had survived. Lila had not. The markings revealed a timeline of descent, starvation, silence, and what could only be called ritual. Another entry read, "He said one must hold the song. One must silence it. I refused." She offered, pale and shaken, interpreted the meaning with the grim resignation of someone who had seen too much. "They were told the music kept something down," he said, "or someone. One had to continue singing to suppress it. When they tried to stop, one of them had to be sacrificed to keep the balance." Emma, weak but alert, reached shakily into her robe and pulled a folded paper from a hidden pocket. Nora took it carefully. It was a page of music, but unlike the others, this one ended with a sharp cutoff followed by a blank space and a handwritten line, "Only if sung by blood may the silence be broken." Isaac whispered, "She can't speak because she gave everything to keep something sealed." In that moment, the chapel above groaned as thunder cracked once more. The lights flickered. A low tone began to resonate again, stronger than before. Something deeper had awakened, and now? It waited. They carried Emma out of the bunker as dawn crept over Ashwood Hollow. The gray sky split with the faint orange of renewal, though the village had never felt more haunted. Her body, frail and barely responsive, trembled at every sound, even the soft tread of boots on stone. Light seemed to cause her pain, so she kept her eyes shut, but her hand never let go of Nora's. The ambulance was silent as it drove away from the chapel. No sirens, just whispers among the paramedics. The doctors later confirmed what Nora had already sensed. Emma was alive, but her mind had been fragmented by years in total darkness, confined by the resonance of sound that echoed endlessly through stone. Her vocal cords, though intact, refused to function. It was not physical damage, but psychological paralysis, a form of catatonic aphasia induced by trauma and repetitive sensory imprint. In the hospital room, surrounded by the sterile hume of machines and the muffled footsteps of nurses, Emma's fingers moved restlessly over the hospital blanket, tracing invisible shapes. Nora began placing the old music sheets before her, one by one, and saw something flicker in her mother's eyes: recognition. When she whispered her own name, Emma looked at her directly for the first time. Her lips formed the shape, Nora, soundless but unmistakable. That night, Nora stayed beside her, going through the journals, the tonal patterns, the encoded lullabies, until she came to the final page Emma had hidden in her robe. It wasn't a song, not in the traditional sense, but a sequence of tonal notations and pauses that matched none of the previous records. When overlaid on the chant Leela had last been recorded humming, a strange symmetry formed. Nora realized it was a counterpart, a musical release to the original containment hymn. Brackett, who had returned with the forensic team to study the diagrams carved into the chamber walls, found corroborating evidence. Symbols beside the altar depicted two figures, one with a halo, one crumbling into smoke, surrounded by dual clefts that intertwined like chains. Underneath, in a mix of Latin and an older dialect, the phrase, "Two must hold the silence, one to remain, one to sing the soul to peace." Nora understood then that her mother had held the containment alone for over a decade after Lila's sacrifice, but Lila's spirit, bound in unfinished resonance, had never been released. The final song, the one only a blood descendant could complete, had never been sung. The next night, as rain once again fell over Ashwood and thunder whispered low, Nora returned to the chapel alone. She brought the final sheet, the tuning fork recovered from beneath the altar, and her own voice, one shaped by the memory of lullabies half-remembered and pain fully felt. She stood at the altar, placed her fingers on the stone where Lila had once knelt, and sang. At first, her voice wavered, revered, small and unsure. But as she moved through the notations, the melody grew, not in volume, but in depth. The air shifted, the walls vibrated. From the darkness beneath, the resonance joined her, as if Emma's silent memory lent strength from afar. A second tone emerged, hollow, grieving, warm, and wrapped around hers like an embrace. Then, at the final note, a sudden stillness, a calm like breath held in reverence. One final gust of wind burst through the chapel, extinguishing the candles. Then, silence. Not oppressive silence, not at peace. Later, when the storm passed, Mavis came to the chapel's doorstep with tears in her sightless eyes. "The song is finished," she said. "She's free now." 3 days after the final song was sung beneath the chapel, the authorities began sealing the underground chamber. The council, the historians, and even the bishop from the diocese agreed. No good could come from keeping that place open. It was not just a site of tragedy, but one of unknowable resonance, a place where memory lived in stone and grief echoed endlessly through frequencies human ears were never meant to bear. The stone masons arrived at dawn with cement and steel, and by nightfall the stairs beneath the altar were filled, bricked over, and blessed. A plaque would later be installed, one that simply read, "In memory of what was kept and what was freed." As the final wheelbarrow of rubble was carried out and the last torch dimmed, something happened, unexplainable, and witnessed by over a dozen people in hushed awe. From beneath the sealed stone, a soft melody rose one final time. It was not haunting. It was not sorrowful. It was a harmony, two voices weaving around one another, one higher, one deeper, both female, both unmistakably familiar. Those who heard it later said it was like hearing the wind sing, like a prayer finally completed, like forgiveness. It lasted no more than 45 seconds. When it ended, no echo followed, just stillness, soft and full. And then a new chapter began. Emma Cartwright, still recovering in the small hospital north of Ashwood, began to regain pieces of her memory. Not all at once, clearly, but in fragments, smells, touches, sounds. Nora visited her daily, bringing soft-voiced recordings of their old home, the hum of their kitchen fridge, the tinkling of wind chimes she used to hang by the porch. One afternoon, Emma motioned for a pencil. She could not yet speak, but her hand moved with growing steadiness. She began to write. What started as single words soon became phrases, and within a week full sentences appeared. "The dark was never empty," she wrote. "It hummed when I stopped singing. It screamed when I slept." As days passed, her writing sharpened with clarity and purpose. She described how Brenton had promised spiritual purification, had convinced them that the song was holy, that their chamber beneath was sacred, that their voices were chosen instruments. She described the night Lila offered herself, not as a victim, but as a shield, demanding Emma carry the melody so her sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. She described how Brenton had promised her its sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. She described how the song was wholly dark. Emma wrote, "Mine had to tell the story." Nora compiled her mother's writings into a journal, carefully scanning each page, transcribing the rest. Emma never asked for it to be published, but she did request a copy be buried in the earth behind the chapel garden, wrapped in cloth and sealed with a ribbon once worn in her quiet days. She said it was for the next voice that might go unhurt. As winter approached, Emma and Nora moved into a small cottage on the outskirts of town, far from the chapel, surrounded by birch trees and the slow rhythm of healing. Emma tended the garden every morning, planting herbs and lilies, while Nora returned to school, studying music therapy. Isaac visited often, sometimes helping build shelves or fixing loose pipes, other times sitting on the porch with Emma as she taught him to write prayers in melodic sequence, what she called songs that listen. One quiet evening, as dusk turned the sky a soft lavender, Emma took out a new notebook, freshly bound, its pages still untouched. She titled the first entry, "What the Silence Taught Me." She wrote of fear, of hope, of the way voices could be stolen, and the miracle of having them returned, not through noise, but through love. She wrote of Leela, who now visited only in dreams, not as a ghost, but as a lullaby. That night, Nora stood outside under the stars and listened. There was no wind, no singing, just the breath of trees and the hum of new beginning. For the first time in 15 years, Ashwood Hollow felt quiet. Not the quiet of secrets buried, but of truths released. And beneath it all, somewhere deep in the memory of stone, the harmony of two mothers lingered, complete, unbroken. Home. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more haunting tales that unfold piece by piece. I'm curious, which moment in the story hit you the hardest? Was it the hidden lullaby, the final harmony, or the silence that followed? And where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. I read every single one.